What's the best strategy for dealing with Russia? That question is on the minds of EU leaders as they meet for talks. Policy towards Putin has divided opinion in the European Union. Is Brussels playing Russian roulette with international relations? This is Roundtable. Hello, I'm Shuli Ghosh. The EU's foreign policy chief reached out to Russia earlier this year in a visit roundly condemned as an embarrassing failure. So what the EU does next is being closely watched. This week, the two sides gave their own gloomy assessments of where things stand. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told reporters there are no relations at all with the European Union at the moment. A low point was how European Council President Charles Michel described it. It was only in February that Josep Borrell, the EU's top diplomat, was in Moscow on an apparent friendship mission. But at a joint press conference, Lavrov derided the EU as an unreliable partner. And during Borrell's visit, opposition leader Alexei Navalny was brought in front of a court to face new charges, while diplomats from Sweden, Poland and Germany were expelled for allegedly supporting pro-Navalny protests. The EU's list of grievances also includes the war in East Ukraine, the treatment of the opposition and minorities by Chechnya's leaders, and accusations of Russian cyber warfare. So, can the EU solve its Russia problem? On the panel today at Roundtable from Tbilisi, we have Natia Seskuria, Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. In Prague, we're joined by Pavel Havlicek, Research Fellow at the Association for International Affairs. And in Brussels, we have Teresa Fallon, Director of the Centre for Russia-Europe-Asia Studies. Good to have all of you with us. Teresa, let me start with you, because that whole visit by Josep Borrell, the press conference with Sergei Lavrov, which very much played out in Moscow's favour, did that really force the EU to realise that it needs clarity on its policy towards Russia?
Indeed, that was the silver lining of that meeting, or at least that's how they tried to spin it, because with 27 EU member states, they all have different relations with Russia. And we know Macron wanted to have a better relationship with Russia, and Borrell was kind of following in those footsteps, this idea of what I call the armchair Kissingers, who feel that if they have a better relationship with Russia, they don't have to worry about China so much. So for them, the worst nightmare is that Russia and China are together. So Borrell's visit, he really did think it was going to be exceptional, that he could somehow pull Russia into their orbit. And he was warned by many other Eastern member states, especially, not to go. And since it turned into such a train wreck of a meeting, and he was literally humiliated during the press conference, in addition to everything else, with 3 EU diplomats actually expelled from the country during the press conference, which is a classic, almost Soviet type of behavior. Lavrov has so much experience. I mean, he was really kind of playing around with Borrell, that when he was returned, they actually had a hearing in the European Parliament about his activities there in Moscow. And even at the time, they wanted to perhaps cooperate with Moscow in order to get the Sputnik vaccine. And before he left, I thought, this might be a good relationship. They could actually see some kind of cooperation between Russia and the EU, but it ended very badly. Yeah. So when he returned, the Europeans were forced to look at Russia with fresh eyes and say, we cannot continue this. We really have to come up with a proper Russia strategy. The way we're going now is not very effective.
Natia, were you surprised by the outcome of this? Because Josep Borrell said before he went that he was justifying his visit because he very much wanted to reverse the deteriorating relations with Moscow. I mean, was that even on the cards? I suppose what happened showed just how bad relations have got.
I think it wasn't even on the card. If Joseph Borrell's visit to Moscow has demonstrated anything, it is a lack of consensus between the EU member states on how to deal with Russia, as well as the need for an intelligent Russia policy. It is more than a decade that EU has been going through phases of engagement and confrontation with Russia. Yet it is clear that resetting relations with Moscow does not work, and the EU has been unable to elaborate strategies that would effectively elaborate the countermeasures to Russia's hostile foreign policy. The way Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov treated Borrell explains how Russia is determined to deal with the EU. And it is clear that there is no appetite or willingness in Moscow to have a more constructive relationship, a dialogue with Moscow. With the EU. Yet Europe, I think, is divided into two camps, engagers and those who advocate for tougher Russia policy. Some European states are reluctant to sacrifice the economic benefits of close cooperation with Russia, while others are advocating for tougher policy. I think Europe must rethink its relations with Moscow for sure, and be clear about its own interests. If the EU is serious about countering Russia's malign activities on its soil, it needs to do so by increasing military, counterintelligence, and cyber capabilities. Most importantly, I think the EU should work very closely with the Biden administration to formulate a joint approach to Russia. And while the US and the EU may have different interests when it comes to Russia, approach to fundamental issues such as human rights violations and attempts to weaken the liberal democratic values must be in line. Most importantly, of course, agreement must be reached over the scrapping of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project, which will further increase the EU's dependency on Russia's energy resources. I think if divisions continue, Russia will be the only player benefiting from the lack of unified and consolidated stance and a sustainable strategy as well among the EU member states.
Yeah,
this will further.
The Nord Stream 2 pipeline is a very important issue to discuss, and we will do that. I just wanted to ask Pavel first about the disagreements in Europe towards how they approach Russia, because, I mean, Alexei Navalny is the latest in a line of disagreements, issues that Europe has with Russia, and the core principles in how Europe approaches Russia very much laid out after the Ukraine crisis of 2014. But why is it that there isn't a cohesive policy in the EU with how to approach Russia?
And thank you for the question. I think I would fully subscribe to both of my predecessors, actually, how they described the current state of play in the EU-Russia relations. I think what is important now is that the situation is changing a little bit, and the Borrell's visit to Moscow actually served as a sort of wake-up call to many in the EU, including Mr. Borrell, who was surprised, how less and not interested and less engaged was actually Russia and its leadership, namely the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, when he also later commented on the mutual relationship that Russia is ready for the final breakup of the partnership between the EU and Russia. So I think this is important, that the times are changing and the days ahead of us actually provide a good opportunity for the European leaders to have a serious review of the mutual relationship and actually strengthen the partnership along the three lines, which is first, what was mentioned by Nadia, which is the resilience component. This is clear to everybody, and it's very much long overdue. The second pillar is obviously a tough approach towards the Russian leadership, and this is something that EU has engaged, over the last couple of days. Just yesterday, new sanctions were approved against individual regime representatives, belonging to the Chechen leadership, actually, of the region in North Caucasus. And finally, this is reaching out to the Russian people and to have a full dual-track, fully institutionalized dual-track policy. If there is going to be efficient and sufficient, actually, political will for that, we will have to see. We know that some of the member states still, as Nadia described, that are interested in pursuing some bilateral ties, and selective engagement, as Borrell was sent started to find out the limits of the possible earlier last month. But I think the situation is changing also in a way that the European leaders, including from Germany, they actually more and more realize that this is not sustainable and Russia doesn't care anymore. So that's why we really need a new, fully new EU strategy on relations with Russia.
Yeah, as far as Josep Borrell goes, he reiterated concerns that Russia was just not interested in cooperation with the EU. Here's what he said.
There is a shared assessment in the Council that Russia is drifting towards an authoritarian state and driving away from Europe. The ministers unanimously interpreted Russia's recent actions and responses as a clear signal of not being interested in cooperation with the European Union.
Teresa, we've touched on the fact that different member states in the EU are advocating a different approach to Russia. Some want closer engagement, some want a more confrontational engagement. One of the things that the Natia mentioned was the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Now that has been very contentious, and Germany in particular doesn't want to jeopardize anything to do with that because it sees the benefits of that as outweighing any kind of, I don't know, human rights demands being made on Russia. What's your take on that?
Well, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is actually a contentious issue in transatlantic relations as well. And this is it was a problem with the Trump administration, and the Biden administration has made it clear that this will also cause frictions in the relationship. And let's not forget, there wasn't really a lot of solidarity shown to Borrell, because about a week after Borrell's visit to Moscow and the train wreck of a visit that it was, Germany had a bilateral meeting with Russia. So they have their own economic interests, which we see with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. The strategy has been to continue to build it and kind of establish facts on the ground, and it's like a fait accompli. And so the Germans, it's almost a Germany first project because it undermines the interests of other EU member states as well as their policy on Ukraine. So it's a very contentious issue, and I'm concerned that this will also be very divisive within the EU. But we'll see how the talks go this week at NATO, and I think that energy security will be key. And so we'll see how the tide is turning very rapidly and accelerating. We see kind of not just, and we have to also keep in mind that Lavrov is in Beijing right now. And so this idea that the Europeans love to think of just Russia separate from China, but the Chinese are clearly signaling that Russia and China are working together. And I think this is something that they must address. So they must not only have a new clearly stated Russia policy, they had to have a Russia-China policy as well as a China policy. But I think that they're most concerned about is this kind of Russia-China cooperation. They're working together in their own neighborhood. We saw them do exercises in the Mediterranean, in the Baltic Sea, and also the Arctic will be a key area of Russia-China cooperation, and that's so close to Europe. So I think that there's a lot on the agenda this week during these meetings at NATO.
That's really interesting because following World War II, I mean, until sort of 2014, there was cooperation between Russia and the EU. You know, they had strategic partnerships. Natia, is there, from what Teresa's saying, that there is this feeling amongst the EU that maybe China is the bigger threat, and so they want to bring, they're still pursuing a relationship with Russia as sort of a balance to that. Are they entirely backing the wrong horse? I mean, is that a strategic mistake?
Well, I think when it comes to Russia's malign activities and Russian aggression, EU countries are more united since Skripal poisonings than they used to be. Europeans agree that deterring Russia from further foreign aggression is important. The EU has kept 3 sanctions programs without interruption following Russia's annexation of Crimea, and the EU states have increased their military spending. So I think that Europeans have a perception of Russia being a hostile actor. Still, despite all this and loud rhetoric towards deterring Russia, Russia has not paid a severe price for example, for poisoning and imprisonment of Alexei Navalny and its aggressive actions in Ukraine, in Georgia, and on European soil. So I think that when it comes to divisions, it is very important for the EU to come to an agreement. And if, for example, Germans come to an agreement to stop the project, it would ring an alarm bell in the Kremlin. At this point, Russians are too used to paying small to no price for their malign actions. In 2016, for example, the former EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Federica Mogherini, has elaborated the 5 guiding principles for EU policy towards Russia, which was advocating for selective engagement. And we saw that selective engagement hasn't worked because Russia is becoming more and more aggressive. Therefore, I think the stance, the strategy towards Russia needs to be unified, which needs to include specific key pillars. And the EU needs to set...
But can it be unified? I mean, this is the problem, isn't it? You have the southern and eastern states wanting closer ties with Russia. You've got the Baltic states and Poland, very contentious relations with Russia. Nord Stream 2 is not even on the table because Germany and France don't want it to be. So when it comes to sanctions, I mean, nothing so far has forced a change in Russian foreign policy. Pavel, I mean, really, is the EU a bit toothless when it comes to dealing with Russian threats?
I would not say toothless. I would say just slow and inefficient so far. We have seen that there are common lines actually on Russia, and the consensus is building slowly but surely. I've already spoken about the sanctions that we have passed just yesterday. 2 additional Chechen leaders were prosecuted for human rights violations through this global human rights sanctions regime. You know, previously to punish Russia for poisoning of Navalny, for Russian regime representatives were put on the list. You know, Russia was symbolically the first one to be targeted by the sanctions. Now it's also China and other countries. But I think the consensus is there. You know, the consensus is that EU should be standing up for human rights and democracy in the world. You know, that it should be kind of protecting and also helping the civil society, but also building up its own resilience, as I spoke about it. I think the elementary, the fundamental consensus is there, but we will need to wait for how much there will be actually on on Thursday, when the discussion on a more strategic approach towards Russia is going to be held. I will just somehow disagree with Nadia, because she when she spoke about the 5 guiding principles and Federica Mogherini advocating for selective engagement, this is not true. The 5 guiding principles had the selective engagement as one of them. You know, don't forget that there is also the 5th guiding principle on supporting Russian civil society and people-to-people ties, but also helping Ukraine, you know, through this Minsk process, and also building up resilience of the Eastern Partnership countries. So this is just a framework that the EU has been having since 2016, as Nadia mentioned. But this is not to selectively engage with Russia, but this is to provide framework for the member states to then actually engage with Russia. This so much depends on the member states. This is not up to Federica Mogherini at that time, but also now up to Josep Borrell, as we saw. You know, these are the member states that determine the strategic approach towards Russia, and this is why the upcoming European Council on Thursday and Friday this week is so crucial in this regard.
I just want to put Russia's defense of the deterioration in relations with the EU. An official statement from the Kremlin this week blamed the EU for those poor relations. It said they have deteriorated due to the non-constructive, sometimes confrontational line of partners. The Russian side has emphasized its readiness to restore a normal, depoliticized format of interaction with the European Union if a real reciprocal interest is shown in this. Teresa, so Russia saying that it has concerns that the EU is not answering. For example, it's worried about the expansion of membership, EU membership to eastern states. It's worried about the expansion of NATO. I mean, are these legitimate threats to Russia's security?
Well, this is the narrative that Russia likes to use. But the problem with EU policy towards Russia, when you have 27 EU member states, it's always the lowest common denominator. And Russia understands this very well and has cultivated relations with Germany, as we see with Nord Stream 2, to do their bidding. And so I think that it's very, very difficult for the EU itself to come up with an effective policy on Russia. So therefore, I think to have other countries kind of help pull the Europeans together, this will help shape their views and possibly come up with a more workable policy towards Russia, because I think this is the biggest challenge. And there's been a lot of complacency and drift in this relationship, and especially in the transatlantic relationship. So under Biden administration, they're trying to revitalize these relations, but that also means to have clear-sighted policies on Russia and China. And there is always this resistance in Europe to see Russia and China working together. And this is what Beijing is signaling. Today, there was a very creepy video in the Global Times saying, is it a coincidence or was it a plan? How Lavrov came to Beijing. You cannot fight Russia and China together.
Isn't that the EU's worst nightmare, Russia and China working together?
It is their worst nightmare, and they are putting their head in the sand on this. So I think that the idea of very simplistically trying to pull Russia in by Borrell going and the meeting ending disastrously had to be a reality check on this magical thinking. And they have got to be far more geopolitically thinking. They call themselves Geopolitical Commission, but they don't act like it. And it's very difficult after all these years of saying we don't do geopolitics to all of a sudden overnight grow geopolitical thinking muscle. And so, as Pavel pointed out, EU member states have their own interests, and that's what they pursue. And they kind of use the EU as a nice shield.
I just want to take that point you were making, Teresa, and just get a reaction from the other guests. Natia, Russia looking more towards China. How real is that threat, and how should the EU be working with the US, given that the Biden administration is taking a much tougher line against Russia than his predecessor?
Well, I would agree with Teresa. I think that is indeed the worst nightmare, and that also brings us to the conclusion that tougher positioning of the Biden administration on Russia's aggression should be seen as an opportunity for the EU to increase coordinated engagement with Washington, which was, I would argue, that this was largely missing during the Trump presidency. We have seen that the worsening of relations with Russia led Washington to take more decisive actions by introducing tougher sanctions. At the same time, it is clear that sanctions that were put in place before had no effect in terms of changing Russia's behavior, as seen by the developments in Ukraine, ongoing aggression and creeping occupation in Georgia, and Russia's attempts to interfere in U.S. elections. The recent cyber attacks have also shown that the meddling in elections in 2016 was not just a unitary operation. It shows continuity in Russia's foreign policy. Such operations are part of the Kremlin strategy, and also when it comes to poisoning and getting rid of its adversaries, Skripal poisoning was not either a unitary operation. We saw in case of Navalny that Kremlin is determined to continue this policy. Thus, the EU needs to work very closely with Biden administration, given the fact that the US itself is very determined to restore the relations with European allies. From what we have seen so far, Biden is determined to reclaim the US leadership and engage closely with NATO allies and strategic partners. And the US, of course, would need to engage with Russia on global issues, as we have seen in case of the extension of START, for example. But
I just want to, because we're coming to the end of the show, and I just want to put a last question to Pavel, quickly, Pavel. If Russia is not interested in dialogue with the EU, do you foresee any kind of consensus building within the EU of how to respond?
I think this is a good opportunity for the EU. In fact, if we have Russia that doesn't care, doesn't want to engage, it might actually lead the EU to building its own consensus on resilience, as I mentioned, but also on how to actually respond to this. Because this is a new challenge, a little bit of new situation. There was always this divide and rule game, that Russia played, and we saw that also recently. And this was a statement also from Sergei Lavrov in Beijing just today that we are not interested in having relations with the EU institutions, but with friendly member states. This is also a lesson for the EU to consolidate, to really work together to actually face some of the challenges. Nadia mentioned the partnership with the United States. This is very important also for